What if I told you that one of history's most successful deception operations wasn't just a Cold War thriller, but a blueprint that's still being used today? Imagine this: you're fighting against a powerful regime, believing you're part of a secret resistance movement, only to discover that every meeting, every plan, every name you've shared has been carefully orchestrated by the very enemy you thought you were fighting. This isn't fiction. This is Operation Trust. And understanding it might just change how you see modern information warfare forever. Let me take you back to 1921. The Russian Civil War had just ended, but for the Bolsheviks, the threat wasn't over. Thousands of anti-communist activists, monarchists, and white Russian emigres had fled across Europe. These weren't just refugees. They were organized, funded, and desperate to overthrow Lenin's new Soviet government. Felix Dzerzhinsky, the ruthless head of the Cheka, the Soviet secret police, faced a problem. How do you fight an enemy you can't see, scattered across dozens of countries, plotting in secret? His solution was diabolical in its brilliance. Instead of hunting down every resistance cell, one by one, why not create a fake resistance movement so convincing that real dissidents would come to you? And that's exactly what he did. The operation was called the Trust, officially known as the Monarchist Union of Central Russia. On paper, it looked perfect: a sophisticated underground network of anti-Bolshevik officers, intellectuals, and monarchists working from within Soviet Russia to overthrow the communist regime. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Cheka didn't just create a fake organization. They staffed it with real former Tsarist officers who had been turned or coerced. They set up legitimate-looking operations, complete with couriers crossing borders, secret codes, and safe houses. They even had a front company called the Moscow Municipal Credit Association to handle finances. Every detail was meticulously crafted to withstand scrutiny. The bait was set, and the targets took it. Hook, line, and sinker. Anti-Bolshevik leaders across Europe, from Paris to Helsinki, from Berlin to Prague, started making contact with the Trust. They shared their plans, their networks, their funding sources. They sent agents into Soviet Russia to coordinate with what they believed were allies on the inside. Some even traveled there themselves. What they didn't know was that every communication was being read, every agent was being tracked, and every mission was being monitored by the very people they were fighting. One of the most famous victims was Sidney Reilly, the legendary British spy who some say was the inspiration for James Bond. Reilly was already a near-mythical figure in intelligence circles, having conducted daring operations against the Bolsheviks. In 1925, he was contacted by the Trust and convinced that a genuine anti-Soviet underground existed. Despite warnings from some colleagues, Reilly crossed into Soviet territory in September 1925 to meet with Trust operatives. He was never seen alive again. The man who had escaped death countless times walked straight into a trap because the deception was that convincing. But Reilly wasn't the only one. The operation compromised dozens of real resistance networks across Europe. Leaders were identified, funding sources were exposed, and entire cells were rolled up. And here's the truly sinister part. Even when some emigres started to have suspicions, even when certain operations seemed too convenient, the Soviet intelligence apparatus had built such elaborate layers of deception that doubters were often convinced by other exiles who had been fooled. The Trust became self-reinforcing. People vouched for something they believed in, not knowing they were vouching for their own destruction. Think about the psychological warfare at play here. Imagine dedicating your life to fighting tyranny, risking everything, losing your country, your home, your family, only to discover that every brave act you thought you were taking was actually tightening the noose around your own neck. When the Trust was finally exposed in 1927, it didn't just destroy organizations. It destroyed morale, trust, and the will to fight. How could you ever trust another resistance movement again? How could you know if your allies were genuine or if you were walking into another elaborate trap? The operation ran for 6 years. 6 years of complete dominance in the intelligence war between Soviet Russia and the émigré community. According to declassified documents, the Trust identified virtually every significant anti-Soviet organization in Europe, neutralized countless operations before they even began, and turned the entire émigré movement into a paranoid, fractured shadow of itself. The cost in human terms: impossible to calculate fully. Dozens executed, hundreds imprisoned, and thousands more living in fear that they might have somehow been compromised. Now, here's where this story becomes incredibly relevant to today. The Soviet Union may have fallen, but the playbook survived. Russia's modern intelligence services, the successors to the KGB, and before that, the Cheka, didn't forget these lessons. They refined them. Operation Trust wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was proof of concept for strategic deception on a massive scale. In 1959, recognizing that the Soviet Union couldn't defeat the West militarily, the Kremlin established Department D within the KGB, specifically tasked with disinformation and strategic deception operations. Operation Trust became the model. Fast forward to the 21st century. we're seeing the same principles adapted for the digital age. Instead of fake resistance movements, we have fake news networks, troll farms, and sophisticated influence operations spread across social media platforms. The objective remains the same: sow confusion, create division, make people question what's real and what's not. When you can't trust your own sources of information, when every piece of news might be manipulated, when former allies might be compromised, you become paralyzed. That's the goal. Consider the Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. elections. Intelligence agencies determined this was a coordinated operation ordered directly by Putin, codenamed Project Lakta. The tactics: create fake social media accounts, spread divisive content, amplify existing tensions, hack and leak emails at strategic moments. Sound familiar? It's the same principle as Operation Trust, just updated for the information age. You don't need to create a fake resistance organization when you can create thousands of fake social media accounts that look like real Americans having real conversations. Or look at the disinformation surrounding the invasion of Ukraine. Russia has deployed what they call Maskirovka, a military doctrine of deception that dates back centuries but has been perfected in modern times. False flag operations, denial of obvious facts, creating multiple contradictory narratives simultaneously so that the truth becomes impossible to pin down. In March 2022, Putin signed a law making it punishable by up to 15 years in prison to spread what the government declares is false information about Russian military operations. Who decides what's false? The same people conducting the operations. It's information warfare, as refined as any physical battle. Here's what makes this so insidious. Operation Trust worked because it exploited the very thing that makes resistance possible: trust and coordination among people fighting for a common cause. Modern disinformation operations work because they exploit the openness of democratic societies and the speed of information in the digital age. We're fighting an enemy that learned a century ago that you don't always need to defeat your opponent directly. Sometimes you just need to make them defeat themselves. Let me share something that still gives me chills. When researchers have gone back and studied Operation Trust in detail, they've found that the Soviet operatives running it were explicitly instructed to create maximum confusion and paranoia. Even when the operation was eventually shut down, the order came to ensure that the exposure would be messy, contradictory, and would leave the émigré community unable to trust each other ever again. The psychological damage was meant to outlast the operation itself, and it worked. Anti-Soviet resistance movements never recovered their former strength. Now think about our current information environment. How many of us have found ourselves unsure what to believe? How many times have you seen a news story and wondered if it's real or if there's some manipulation you're not seeing? How many relationships have been damaged by disagreements over what's true? That uncertainty, that erosion of shared reality. That's the modern inheritor of operations like the Trust. And unlike a specific operation that runs for 6 years and then ends, today's disinformation campaigns are continuous, overlapping, and coming from multiple directions simultaneously. But here's where we get to the crucial part. Understanding these operations is the first step in defending against them. The émigrés who fell for Operation Trust weren't stupid. They were desperate, isolated, and facing an enemy that had unlimited resources and was willing to invest years into a single deception operation. We have advantages they didn't. We can study the history, recognize the patterns, and develop defenses, both technological and psychological, against these tactics. What does that defense look like? First, media literacy. Understanding how information spreads, who benefits from certain narratives, and what the goals might be behind various stories. Second, source verification. In the age of the Trust, verification meant knowing people personally and trusting their word. Today, it means checking multiple independent sources, understanding the difference between primary and secondary sources, and being willing to say, I don't know, when information is unclear. Third, resilience against emotional manipulation. Both old and new operations rely heavily on triggering strong emotional responses, anger, fear, hope, that bypass critical thinking. Let me give you a practical example. During Operation Trust, émigrés were often told about imminent uprisings in Russia that never materialized. The constant promise of just wait, something big is coming, kept people engaged and prevented them from questioning the organization. Today, we see similar tactics in various conspiracy theories and disinformation campaigns. Always a big revelation coming, always a major event just around the corner, but somehow the evidence never quite arrives. Recognizing that pattern is a defense mechanism. The story of Operation Trust is also a reminder about the importance of institutional memory and historical knowledge. One reason these tactics keep working is that each generation has to relearn the lessons the hard way. The intelligence community knows about Operation Trust. They study it, they teach it. But the general public, most people have never heard of it, which makes them vulnerable to updated versions of the same con. That's why education matters. That's why understanding history matters. The patterns repeat because we forget to watch for them. There's also a more uncomfortable truth we need to confront. Operations like the Trust succeed because they offer something people desperately want to believe in. The Emigrest wanted to believe that there was organized resistance inside Russia. They wanted to believe their cause wasn't hopeless. They wanted to believe they could reclaim what they'd lost. Those desires made them vulnerable. Today, people want to believe they have access to secret truth that others don't see. They want to believe there are simple explanations for complex problems. They want to believe they're part of a group that truly understands what's happening. Those same desires make us vulnerable. This isn't about becoming paranoid or trusting nothing. That's the opposite extreme, and it's just as paralyzing as believing everything. It's about developing a calibrated skepticism, being open to information while maintaining critical faculties, and understanding that the truth usually requires effort to verify. The participants in Operation Trust could have been saved if even a fraction of them had maintained healthy skepticism and insisted on verification of claims. But once the deception reached critical mass, questioning it meant questioning the entire resistance, and that psychological pressure kept people in line. So what does all this mean for you? For us, for how we navigate an information environment that sometimes seems designed to deceive. It means we need to be smarter about how we consume information. It means we need to teach these lessons to the next generation. It means we need to demand transparency from our institutions while recognizing that adversaries will exploit that transparency. It's a delicate balance, and frankly, we're still figuring out how to walk that line in the digital age. But here's what gives me hope. We're having this conversation. More people are aware of these tactics than ever before. Researchers are studying influence operations in real time and developing countermeasures. Platforms are, slowly and imperfectly, getting better at identifying and removing coordinated, inauthentic behavior. We're not defenseless, we're just fighting a kind of war that most of us didn't know existed until recently. And knowledge is the first weapon in that fight. The story of Operation Trust is ultimately a story about the power of information and the vulnerability of truth. It's about how easily human psychology can be exploited when people are desperate or afraid. It's about the long game, investing years into a deception because the payoff is worth it. And it's a warning from history that the same tactics that worked in 1921 can still work today if we're not vigilant. Think about this the next time you see information that perfectly confirms what you already believe or that makes you feel strong emotions. Ask yourself, who benefits if I believe this? What would change if I verified this before sharing it? Am I being manipulated into a particular response? These questions don't make you paranoid, they make you resilient. And resilience is what defeats deception operations. I want to hear from you. Have you ever fallen for something that later turned out to be misleading or completely false? What made it convincing? And more importantly, what made you realize the truth? Drop a comment below, and let's talk about how we can all get better at navigating this complex information landscape. Your experiences might help someone else recognize when they're being manipulated. And if you're finding this kind of deep dive into historical events and their modern relevance valuable, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel is all about uncovering the patterns in history that help us understand today's world. We've got more stories like this coming, stories about psychological operations, influence campaigns, and the hidden history that explains current events. Don't miss out. The reality is that understanding Operation Trust isn't just about knowing a fascinating piece of history. It's about recognizing that we're all potential targets of sophisticated deception operations every single day. The battlefield has moved from secret meetings in smoky rooms to our phones, our computers, our social media feeds. The weapons aren't guns and bombs, they're narratives, emotions, and carefully crafted lies mixed with just enough truth to be believable. And the stakes. Nothing less than our ability to know what's real and make decisions based on facts rather than manipulation. So here's my final thought. The people who fell for Operation Trust weren't weak or foolish. They were fighting for something they believed in against overwhelming odds. But they lost because they didn't have the tools or the knowledge to recognize the deception until it was too late. We have those tools. We have that knowledge. We have the ability to learn from their mistakes. The question is whether we'll use those advantages or whether 100 years from now, people will look back at our time and wonder how we fell for the same patterns all over again. That choice is ours to make. Every day, every time we encounter information, every time we decide to share or believe or question. Make it wisely. Your ability to discern truth from fiction might be the most important skill you develop in the 21st century. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video.